Hey everyone, and welcome to another screencast in our Western Civ course. I wanted to spend a little time talking today about the Protestant Reformation. This is an event that takes place in the 16th century. It takes place, some might argue, in the context of the late Middle Ages, what our textbook has referred to as a period of crisis and disintegration. And that period in the late Middle Ages sets the context and sets the tone of what takes place in the early part of the 16th century, known as the Reformation. It was a revolution, I would argue, based on ideology or ways of thinking. And in particular, this was religious ways of thinking, but it was an important ideological revolution, one of the more successful ideological revolution in the West. And the touchstone for this upheaval would be this little university professor and monk named Martin Luther. So I want to spend some time talking about this event, and hopefully you'll find this somewhat interesting. Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses in October of 1517, and about 100 years later, roughly 7 out of 10 Germans lived in areas that no longer maintained allegiance to Rome. And there were roughly 4 out of 10 Europeans who also lived in areas that no longer paid allegiance to Rome. And when you think about it, these statistics are pretty remarkable. In fact, I think it's one of the unique achievements for any modern ideology. When you compare this to other ideological revolutions, particularly something like the outbreak of communism, which I think is probably the closest parallel here in terms of ideological revolutions, the Protestant Reformation was incredibly successful in terms of converting people to their particular way of thinking. So I think it's worth some time asking this important question: why was the Reformation so successful? And I think that there are a couple of reasons why the Reformation was successful. Some of these reasons I'll categorize as negative reasons why the Reformation was as successful as it was. And then I'll also spend a little bit of time talking about some of the positive reasons why the Reformation was so successful. So let's take a look at this a little bit. So one of the first reasons I would say that the Reformation was so successful was in fact a negative reason, and that is the inability of the secular powers to stop the spread of the Reformation. The Holy Roman Empire of the early 16th century was very fragmented. And in 1356, an agreement called the Golden Bull had arranged that over 300 independent units of this empire, and these included cities and duchies and princedoms, etc., would be governed by an aristocratic federation of 7 elector states. And each of these states would have 1 vote in the election of the emperor. Now, for our purposes, the most important of these electors was a guy named Frederick the Wise of Saxony. And the secular powers that existed in the day, including Frederick the Wise, were faced with a number of impending problems that really kept the attention of these secular powers away from Martin Luther and his Reformation. The German Empire faced rebellion in Spain. They faced war with France. They faced problems with the Turkish invasion up the Danube River. The threat of the Islamic Turks was always a threat to Western European powers. And all of these things tended to split the interest of the empire and made it easy to ignore the comments of a small Augustinian friar named Martin Luther who lived in Saxony. So I want to emphasize the importance of the secular powers. They had so many irons in the fire, as it were, that by the time they sat up and took notice of what was going on in Saxony and what Martin Luther was saying, the cat, as it were, had been left out of the bag. Another important negative reason as to why the Reformation was as successful as it was really the inability of the church to deal with this either. The church was in such disarray in the late Middle Ages. You probably remember reading about this in your textbook. But this was the period of the so-called Avignon papacy in the early 13th or the early 14th century, and the Great Schism also in the 14th and early 15th century. This was a period where the upper echelons of the Catholic Church were in disorder and were in disarray, and their authority had been greatly diminished. The other thing that I'd mention about the church in the late Middle Ages is that areas in Northern Europe were particularly difficult to pastor or to control. In the Netherlands, for example, there were only 4 bishoprics over roughly 3 million people. So, it's pretty easy to understand how difficult it might be for the church to monitor things that were going on in Northern Europe. The clerics were poorly educated. Sometimes they were morally lax. Sometimes they were just absent. And so one can sort of get a sense of how and why there was this kind of anti-clerical tendencies in some pockets in Europe. And when you combine that with the appeal of the Reformation, you can see how a movement like this could have been so successful so quickly. Okay, so I want to emphasize that. Now, the other thing that I wanted to mention here, and I'm not sure whether to put this as a negative or a positive reason, is the influence of Renaissance humanism. In 1524, Erasmus said this. He said, "I laid the egg and Luther hatched it." So people like Luther and Zwingli and John Calvin and a lot of these other reformers were all university trained. Some, like Luther and his sidekick Philip Melanchthon, were university professors. And so many of their great supporters were intellectuals and humanists. And so Renaissance humanism that you found in the universities and in the schools was a really important factor in this. One of the things that the Renaissance humanists did was that they studied the classics. And in this case, they studied the classics for Christian purposes. This also involved a return to Christian antiquity. By the way, that's what the little symbols mean of X and P. That's actually a chi in a row, which is the beginning of the word for Christos. So it's just a shorthand for Christianity. And so these humanists had developed scholarly standards for the study of ancient texts. And in the Renaissance, of course, they studied these classical texts like Cicero and Virgil and others. But these intellectuals were Christians as well, and so they were also interested in the Bible. And they tried to communicate their pride and excitement at uncovering past wisdom, whether that was in the classical sense or in the scriptural or spiritual sense, by translating these texts into vernacular languages. So that's what you begin to see in the early part of the 16th century, is the translation of these texts, these Bible translations, into vernacular languages, into languages like French and German. And Erasmus, who's pictured here, played a very important role in this. He is the one who established the Greek New Testament and was really a leader of these humanistic scholarly students. He published, as I mentioned, a Greek New Testament, and this might not seem all that terribly exciting to us, but remember, Erasmus was arguing that everyone was capable of reading and understanding the Bible for themselves. And in a period where you could potentially be charged with heresy, this was a pretty dangerous business to be in. And so Erasmus provided his Greek New Testament for precisely the reason that he believed that Christians should have the opportunity to read the Bible on their own. And he understood the consequences of this, but he did it nonetheless. So this was the position of the humanists, that is, a study of antiquity, not just classical antiquity, but Christian antiquity. And the early Protestant reformers clearly agreed with Erasmus. Now, I might just mention here that Erasmus and Luther were contemporaries. Erasmus was a Catholic. Luther eventually broke with the Catholic Church. And Erasmus refused to kind of go the same distance that Luther did in terms of his reforms. So at one point, I just think it's an important point to have mentioned that Erasmus did his reforming from the humanist perspective. He did his reforming within the Catholic Church rather than breaking from it. So I do think that there really is a point to be said when he said that when Erasmus said that he laid the egg that Luther hatched, and the Catholic Church didn't see this at first. Although again, Erasmus was a Catholic, but the Catholic Church didn't see this at first, and it took them some time before they finally were able to address this issue. One of the other important elements that I wanted to mention here has to do with the attitude of anti-clericalism. Now, again, I'm not sure whether this should be categorized as a negative or a positive reason, but it is an important point to make because it does set the context or the ethos of what's going on in European society at the time. There was this feeling of anti-clericalism that was present in much of the population in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. In part, this had to do with the decline of church authority in this period, in the late Middle Ages, what your textbook calls this period of crisis and disintegration. This is the period, as I mentioned earlier, of the Avignon papacy and the Great Schism, that had a lot to do with creating this attitude of suspicion and concern in the 14th and early 15th century, where you had popes living in places like Avignon in southern France, in Germany, and this schism, which meant that you had more than one pope at one time. This was a real scandal in the church, and it created a feeling of anti-clericalism that really was sort of a deep-seated feeling in the European mindset in the late Middle Ages. Erasmus actually wrote about this. He wrote a book called The Praise of Folly, in which he talked a little bit about some of the problems in the church. He did it as a satire, and it really sort of hit the church quite hard. But this notion of corruption and anti-clericalism, one always has to remember that the Catholic Church is a fairly easy target. It's big. It encompasses the world, as it were. And so when times happen where things don't go very well in the church, it's very easy for people to become disillusioned. When I teach this, I often compare the attitude toward the Catholic Church. I compare that to similar attitudes that crop up from time to time with regard to our government. If you think about the federal government in the United States right now, there are a lot of people who are disillusioned with politics and with government. And it's that same kind of attitude. And it's a hard thing to pinpoint as to why precisely people feel the way that they do. But when you're given an easy target like the federal government, which encompasses such a large part of our lives, it's very easy for people to cast aspersions against this institution for reasons that are both legitimate in some cases and illegitimate in other cases. So it's that kind of attitude that I think best represents the mindset of people in the late Middle Ages. This notion of anti-clericalism is really something that's important, and it does help, I think, to explain why the Reformation was as successful as it was. So let's keep that in mind as we move forward. So why was the Reformation so successful? Well, I'm going to suggest that there are three basic reasons why the Reformation was as successful as it was. One of them had to do with the messengers themselves. That is, the people who were the primary leaders of the Protestant Reformation. I'm going to suggest, too, that the message was important and it had a wide appeal. And then finally, I'm going to also mention the media, that is, the popular images and the way in which these ideas were communicated to the masses and to the general public. Now, I don't have time to speak to all of the major players in this Reformation, but I did want to focus a little bit of attention to Martin Luther. Martin Luther was the son of a miner born in Saxony in central eastern Germany in 1483. He did his undergraduate work at the University of Erfurt, and he earned a bachelor's degree. He earned a master's degree. He earned the master's degree by the age of 19 in 1502. His father, of course, had hoped that he would become a lawyer and that he would, probably work for a king or for a bishop. That was generally one of the tracks that people had in mind for their children. He began his law studies in May of 1505, but we learned that in July of 1505, he was caught in a terrible thunderstorm, and it scared him so badly that he made a vow that if God allowed him to survive, he would enter a monastery, what we sometimes call today as a foxhole conversion. Well, he did survive, and in that same month, he entered an Augustinian cloister in the town of Erfurt. And he was a bright and willing student. He went on to be an avid student of biblical studies. In 1508, he became a lecturer at the new university in Saxony called the University of Wittenberg. And in 1512, at about 30 years old, he was promoted to a doctorate in theology at the university, and in 1513, he began to lecture on the Bible. And the books that he spent the most time lecturing on were the Psalms, the book of Romans, Galatians, and also the book of Hebrews. These were Bible books that Luther felt were extremely important. And in his notes, we begin to see some elements of his theology very early on in these days as a Bible lecturer. Now, to the outside observer, he was destined to be a university preacher and teacher within the order of the Augustinians. But Luther had some issues. His inner life was something that was in turmoil. He's one of the few people that we can really get a sense of their psychological makeup, as it were. I mean, it's not something where we can put Luther on a couch, as some historians have actually tried to do. But he did write a lot about his inner troubles. He wrote a series of memoirs late in his life, and he reflects on these early days as the leader of the Protestant Reformation. And you do get a sense of some of the inner troubles that he faced in these early days. The big thing that Luther was troubled with was this question of how a person can be saved. Or to put this more specifically, how can a person be justified before a holy and a righteous God? Now, Christians, of course, took it for granted that human beings were fallen and that they actually needed to be saved. But if you were Luther living in the late Middle Ages, you would have likely answered that question by doing what he did, which was to join a monastic order of monks and to live the monastic life. And so as a monk and as a friar, Luther had adopted what was really a traditional answer to this question of salvation by living under a monastic rule. He disciplined his senses. He lived, the life of an ascetic monk. And these were traditional means by which hundreds, if not thousands, of people had taken on to enter into salvation. He tries very hard to meet the demands of the monastic life, but he always felt that he didn't quite live up to the ideals of the monastic order. And he felt a lot of sorrow over the sins that he committed, and he felt that no amount of fasting or prayer or any of that sort of those monastic works could comfort him. And he never felt like he'd done enough for the forgiveness of sins. At one point, in fact, his confessor, a guy by the name of John Staupitz, told him to come back when he had really sinned. In other words, he would go to confession pretty regularly, and Staupitz at one point said, "Listen, Luther, come back when you've really sinned." But he was troubled for a number of years, and we know this because later in life, as I mentioned, he described his feelings in a series of memoirs, and he basically admitted that he was angry with God. You see this in the quote here from his memoirs in 1545, where he says, "Though I lived as a monk without reproach, I felt that I was a sinner before God with an extremely disturbed conscience. I could not believe that he, that is God, was placated," which is a fancy word to mean satisfied, that God was satisfied by my satisfaction. And what he's basically saying there is that he can't believe that God is satisfied by his monastic life. "I did not love, yes, I hated the righteous God who punishes sinners, and secretly, if not blasphemously, I was angry with God and said, quote, 'As if indeed it's not enough that miserable sinners eternally lost through original sin,'" a reference there to Adam and Eve, "eternally lost through original sin, are crushed by every kind of calamity by the law of the Decalogue." Of course, that's a reference to the Ten Commandments. So he says, if it's not enough that people are lost through original sin and they're brutally beaten down, as it were, by the Ten Commandments, without then having God add pain to pain by the gospel, and also the gospel threatening us with his righteousness and wrath. Thus I raged with a fierce and troubled conscience. Nevertheless, I beat importunately upon Paul, that is the Apostle Paul, at that place most ardently desiring to know what St. Paul wanted. So you get this sense of a person who is really troubled in his inner life. He's concerned that he feels guilty because he's not living up to the demands of the gospel, to the demands of the Ten Commandments, and he feels that God is ultimately punishing him and that he's not able to ultimately satisfy God. Now, I want to mention here, of course, that not everybody felt this way who lived the monastic life, but Luther clearly does have some inner issues here. Again, I don't want to psychoanalyze him here, but he does have some very serious issues with regards to the sensitivity, one might say, for sin that was in his own life. So between 1512 and 1517, while he was teaching and lecturing on Paul, that is particularly in the book of Romans, he worked out his own solution to this problem. And the key text for him was a text that he found in Romans chapter 1, verse 17. And that passage says, "He who is righteous shall live by faith," or "the righteous shall live by faith." And he found in this passage a solution to his problem of salvation. In order to be saved, he argued, a person cannot rely on the good works of the monastic life, or penance, or contrition, simply feeling sorry for sin, but rather one can only rely on the grace of God. And as Luther comes to this conclusion in reading from the Apostle Paul, he writes again in 1545 that it's here, I'm quoting, "It's here that I felt that I was altogether born again and had entered paradise itself through open gates." So Luther was not in the self-help school, as it were. He did not think that the monastic life was really the key to salvation. He said you couldn't earn it. And he said that the just shall live by faith. And I wanted to add something here because Luther adds this as well. It's not just justification by faith, but it's justification by faith alone. Okay? So he who is righteous, he does in a sense, if I may, suggest that Luther does add a little bit to what Paul says here, that it's he who is righteous shall live by faith alone. So Luther says that for reasons known only to God, God reaches across that human void, as it were, and picks certain people to be saved. He did believe in the concept of predestination. But God gives salvation to some, and they respond by belief and by faith. Salvation is a gift, and humans really do nothing to earn it. And so as you can imagine, he has this tremendous sense of relief when he comes to this conclusion. Now, I might just say here that many people in Luther's day, had they known about this, would have seen Luther as really heretical in terms of his beliefs. Of course, Luther didn't think he was a heretic, so this had no immediate issue, and it probably would have remained that way because, remember, nobody really pays much attention to university professors anyway. But his inner convictions, his beliefs, crossed paths with some really important circumstances that brought Luther's ideas from the university classroom out into the open. And that issue, that important circumstance, had to do with the indulgence controversy. The indulgence controversy. So I want to just mention the indulgence controversy for just a minute here, and I don't want to get into too many details here. I've got an image here of an indulgence box. An indulgence was basically a note, if you will, a letter, or some sort of a document that you would purchase through a donation that you would make to the church. An indulgence was, there was a fairly long history to the practice of indulgences, but basically the idea is that you do some sort of good work in exchange for some kind of spiritual benefit. Okay, and without going into a lot of the details here, there were some indulgences that were being sold during the time of Martin Luther, basically to raise money to build St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. And these indulgences irritated Luther. Indulgences, as you can imagine, were caught up in the world of fundraising. And whatever you think about their theology and how they worked, and we could talk about this later on if you're interested, there's always that fine line between fundraising and corruption, right? It's perfectly normal for religious institutions and causes to go about and ask people to donate money. But it's a very fine line that's easily crossed from fundraising to something that is perhaps not in keeping with the ideals of Christian charity. And so this particular indulgence in the early part of the 16th century was something that really irritated Luther. And there were people who were out selling these indulgences in Saxony. One of them was a guy named John Tetzel. And he was a Dominican friar, and he went around Germany preaching an indulgence that was initiated by the Pope Leo X. And it was designed, as I mentioned, to raise funds for the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica. And Tetzel was this flamboyant and some might argue annoying preacher who really expanded the theology of the indulgence so that all you had to do was really purchase one of these pieces of paper, and the idea was that you would be sort of home free. Purchase this piece of paper and you immediately get into heaven. He had one of these sayings that's recorded for us, that when a coin in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs. Now, this is not particularly good theology, I might add here, but this is the sort of thing that was circulating in Luther's day, and it really got him pretty well worked up. He was shocked from a pastoral perspective to see ordinary parishioners buying indulgences that they thought would free them from sin. And he came to the conclusion that if he was right in his conclusion about salvation, then indulgences were deeply offensive and wrong. And so he fired off a letter to the Archbishop of Mainz, never got an answer back about this. And so it was in this controversy, if you will, over indulgences, that Luther, on Halloween in 1517, posted his famous 95 Theses on the door of the Castle Church in Wittenberg, Germany. This is a modern image of it, which you can go to today and see it. Now they've sort of etched the 95 Theses on the door of this church. Initially, this would have been a traditional way to invite debate on a topic among university students and professors. But if you look at the 95 Theses, many of these theses are related to the sale of and practice of and theology of indulgences. I've listed a couple of here, and you can look these up for yourself, but here's one from number 32. Those who believe that they can be certain of their salvation because they have an indulgence letter will be eternally damned together with their teachers. Now, this sort of thing would not sit very well with the Catholic authorities. Or any true Christian, number 37, whether living or dead, participates in all the blessings of Christ and the church, and this is granted him by God even without indulgence letters. So there are all sorts of things like that really speak to this issue of indulgence. So this controversy really caused Luther's ideas to get out of the classroom and into the streets of Saxony. And it's one of the things that really caused the Reformation and the theology of the Reformation to get into the popular mindset of the day. And so this is a really important event that helps to get Luther and his ideas, as it were, on the map. So in addition to the major players of the Protestant Reformation, the other thing that I wanted to mention here is the message. And Luther's message is a fairly straightforward one. It involved a couple of major points that I just wanted to outline here for you. It's really between 1517 and 1520 that Luther began to change his views. He published a series of pamphlets that express these main ideas. And in these works, of which one of them was the address called the Address to the German Nobility, it was probably the most important address, one of his 1520 addresses that he did. And it's in this pamphlet that he laid out some of these fundamental principles of the Protestant Reformation, of his beliefs. And it was these main principles that would provide sort of the theological backbone to the Reformation. Other early reformers, including people like Erasmus, wanted to improve behavior. Luther didn't want to just improve behavior. He also wanted to change things radically. So I want to mention here very clearly that earlier reformers had recognized, people always recognize, that major institutions like this need to clean up their act, as it were. What Luther wants to do, though, is fundamentally change the theology of the Catholic Church. And so he's taking this a step further. He answered the question, how can I be saved, by this notion of sola fide, salvation by faith alone. Salvation was an undeserved gift. Second, he dealt with the question of authority. And this question addresses the issue of where do we find religious authority? Is it found in the individual? Is it found in the church? Is it found in the Pope? Is it found in the Bible? Where do you find religious authority? When there are disputes, as there often are within the Christian community, where do you go to get answers? If you put this in the context of the United States, when we have disputes over law, for example, we have a court system that's given the authority to interpret for us what the law means. And if that debate continues to rise up through the ranks, ultimately the Supreme Court has the authority to determine what the Constitution, the basis of our law in the United States, what the Constitution means. So this question of authority is important. Where do you find religious authority? And Luther's answer to that was that you don't find religious authority in the church or in councils or in bishops or in traditions. You find authority in the Scripture and in the Scripture alone. So in one fell swoop, as it were, Luther rendered all of the church councils, all of the church traditions, all of these things invalid. Okay? So this is a really important point. And it does fundamentally change the traditional way people understood where they found religious authority. Third, he wanted to know where the church is to be found. Remember that in the early Middle Ages, this question was answered primarily in the papacy, in the Pope. And after the crisis of the 14th century, some people argued that the church was to be found in councils. That is, after the crisis of the Avignon papacy or the Great Schism, people said, well, maybe instead of having the church located primarily in the Pope, it should be in the Council of Bishops. And so this is something referred to as the conciliar movement. Luther rejected all of that, and he said that the church is ultimately found in the priesthood of all believers. He stripped away any distinction between the clergy on the one hand and the laity on the other. Remember, Catholics have always said that priests and ordained people are fundamentally different from lay people. You know, there's this sort of hierarchical notion within the church. Bishops, priests, and deacons are fundamentally different. But Luther took to democratizing the church hierarchy and wanted to bring everyone down to an equal playing field. The only difference, Luther argued, is in the jobs that they're given. Some people might be given the job of preaching, and others might be given the job of being butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers. But all believers, the priesthood of all believers, means that everyone is equal in the church. Fourth, I would say here, Luther is referred to as a magisterial reformer because he wanted to reform the magistrates. In other words, Luther saw this as a top-down reformation, okay? He'd hoped that the magistrates, that is the princes and the powers that be, would buy into this reform movement and actually reform their territories, okay? So it's important to note this magisterial reform. He saw the process of Reformation happening as a top-down event from the magistrates down into the masses. So these are the main elements of the message of Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformers. And I would say this message, particularly in the context of the kind of anti-clericalism that you see in the late Middle Ages, this message was extremely popular. Let me just illustrate one way in which this was popular. The princes of Germany and England and France and Spain, of course, all owed what you and I might call taxes to the church. They would call it a tithe. But we would call this taxes, not unlike the way you and I pay federal income taxes nowadays. And Luther's big point to the German nobility in 1520 was, hey, stop sending all your money to Rome. Keep it for yourselves, right? And you can imagine how appealing this would have been to German princes, irrespective of their theology, irrespective of what they thought about salvation or authority or the church. That whole idea of being able to keep the money for yourselves rather than sending it to Rome would have been a pretty appealing draw for these princes to initiate the Protestant Reformation in their territories. So this idea of democratizing and sort of eliminating the priesthood, eliminating this notion that priests and popes and bishops and deacons and all of these ordained people are somehow higher up on the religious scale, democratizing all of this was very, very appealing to many, many people, and I think helped to make the Reformation as successful as it was. Now, Luther published his tracts in 1520, and you can imagine this would have had some pretty important ramifications. He was called to attend the Diet of Worms in 1521. Just prior to that, he was excommunicated by the church in 1520 for his views. He was given a chance to defend himself at the Diet of Worms, but he stood his ground, and he said that he really wasn't going to recant any of the things that he had written. And so his excommunication stood firm. He was protected by his friend Frederick the Wise, his protector, and he was, by May of 1521, considered an outlaw. And he had to take refuge in the Wartburg Castle that was owned by Elector Frederick the Wise. He conducted a couple of really important literary endeavors in those days, including the translation of the German Bible, translation of the New Testament into German. And, this was a really important piece of work that he did. But this was a tough and difficult time in his life. There were social implications to this as well. Luther married in 1525 to Catherine von Borgia. One of the things that the Protestant reformers, almost all of them did when they adopted the Protestant Reformation, if these people were clerics, one of the ways that they announced, if you will, their adherence to the Reformation principles was that they abandoned their monastic vows or their clerical vows of celibacy and got married. And Luther was one of those who abandoned his vow of celibacy as an Augustinian friar and got married in 1525. Some of the other implications, including that, included things like these monks and nuns rejecting their vows. These were vows that they had made legitimately before God, that they had rejected those vows. That priests were seen now as teachers rather than sacramentalists, if you will, and that the Bible was produced in more and more vernacular languages, and this made it easier for the average person, if you will, to read the Bible and to kind of glean from it things for themselves. I also want to mention here the importance of the printing press in all of this. And this gets us into the importance of the media as to why the Reformation was as successful as it was. Somewhere around 1450 in Germany, print with movable type was invented. And this had a tremendous influence on modern society. And Luther was one of the first people to really be able to take advantage of this new technology and the profound influence that it would have. Just to give you an idea of some of the things that Luther was able to publish and why his ideas were able to spread so quickly, Luther published somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 tracts with a combined sale of roughly 300,000 copies. I mentioned earlier in 1520 his address to the German nobility. That sold 2,000 copies in 5 days. It's a remarkable spread of ideas through the use of the printing press. He published 3,100 separate works between 1517 and 1546, and that excludes his catechism, Luther's famous catechism, and the Bible, for a total of some 3.1 million copies. So this is a remarkable achievement in early modern societies. The Weimar edition of Luther's works today, if you go to a library that contains these, has roughly 100 volumes in it, and these are not small volumes. These are very thick volumes of Luther's works. So the media was really important in terms of spreading his ideas beyond the university classroom out into the wider reading public. And the print media, of course, was important to this, but I want to just mention, too, that there were other non-literate forms of communication as well that helped to make these ideas, to get these ideas out into the public. And I want to just mention a couple of these and show you some examples of them. What you're looking at are woodcuts. This is a woodcut, and these woodcuts were often used to help communicate popular ideas. Both Protestants and Catholics use these woodcuts to communicate ideas. Today, you'd maybe compare them somewhat to political cartoons that you find in newspapers. But they're a way to communicate poignant ideas in graphic form that non-literate people can understand. So in this particular woodcut, for example, Jesus is driving out the money changers on the left-hand side of this woodcut, and then on the right-hand side of this woodcut is the Pope being displayed as the great money changer. And so, the message here is a simple message. It's a very clear message that the Pope is bad, the Catholic faith, the Catholic Church is bad, and just as Jesus drove out the money changers in his day, so we too should be driving out the Pope, who is the great money changer. So it's woodcuts like these that really helped to get the idea of the Protestant reformers out of the classroom and into the streets. I'll show you another one here. On this woodcut, you see at the top, inside what appear to be clouds, you see an image of a preacher and people devoutly listening to the preacher, baptizing babies, and also taking communion. On the bottom part of the woodcut are the flames of hell, the very bottom of that image, and surrounding that are monks and cardinals. The cardinals are wearing the sort of barbershop quartet hats, and the Pope is seated at the right. And so there's this image of brutality and chaos, and you'll see an indulgence letter toward the bottom center of that image, and the flames of hell sort of consuming the church and consuming the Pope. So again, the message is very clear. Good religion on the top with a preacher and devout hearers, bad religion on the bottom. Okay, contrasting Protestantism to the Catholic Church. Here's another woodcut that I like. In the center of this woodcut is Martin Luther himself in the pulpit preaching. Beneath him are people who are devoutly kneeling and receiving the cup and taking communion on the left-hand side. And then on the right, if you can discern this, if you can see this, you'll see the head of a beast. And in its mouth is the church, is the Catholic Church and its representatives, monks, cardinals, bishops, and of course the Pope, who is seated toward the bottom of the beast's mouth. And out of the mouth are coming flames of hell. The image here is an image of the book of Revelation and the beast from hell. If there's one thing that Protestants agreed on, and they didn't always agree on everything, of course, but if there was one thing that the early Protestant reformers agreed, and that was this notion that the Pope was the Antichrist, that he was connected in some way to the pit of hell and the beast of hell. And those things are illustrated perfectly in this woodcut. Here's another interesting one where you have the seal of the Pope with the two keys and a papal hat which is turned upside down, and people taking turns coming up and defecating in the Pope's hat. So again, you don't need to be theologically astute to look at this stuff and to get the point, right? You don't need to understand even basic rudiments of salvation by faith or salvation by works or justification or sanctification or any of these fancy theological terms. You can look at this woodcut and get a chuckle out of this and get the point that the Pope is bad and the Protestant reformers are good. By the way, these are ones that are done by Protestants. The Catholics were every bit as good at making these woodcuts and depicting Luther in similar kinds of ways. Here's another favorite of mine where, again, you have this beast who is sitting on an indulgence letter with a locked Bible and with the Pope who is getting ready to go into the mouth of the beast. In the mouth of the beast are bishops and cardinals and monks. And this person with a key in his hand, that's the Pope, and he's getting ready to be taken into the mouth of this beast. And the beast, of course, is sitting on an indulgence letter. You can see that where he's seated there. He's sitting on top of an indulgence letter. And so all of this imagery helped to confirm the notion of the Protestant Reformation and helped to spread the ideas of the Reformers far and wide. And this really does, at the end of the day, bring about what many scholars have suggested as being the end of Christendom. This notion of the Christian kingdom where people were unified around their belief, and that belief was centered in the Catholic Church. That unity of the West, of the Latin West, had been, in the early part of the 16th century, rent asunder. And from this point on, right up to the present day, the Christian church and the Christian community has been deeply split along many lines. And within Protestant communions, of course, that split has continued to proliferate to the point now where it's not just a question of having Protestants and Catholics, but having many different kinds of Protestants, from the Anglicans and the Episcopalians in England or the United States to Lutherans and Presbyterians and Baptists and all different kinds of Methodists and Pentecostals and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Many different types of Protestant churches. All you need to do is go to the Yellow Pages and you can see the kinds of churches that are out there. So, at one level, the Protestant Reformation attempted to introduce a series of reforms, but on the other hand, it also rent asunder that religious unity that so characterized Western Europe for many, many centuries, all the way back to really the beginning of the Christian church. The 16th century split that unity, and it's something that we feel right to this present day. So there you have a very brief survey of some of the elements of the Protestant Reformation, some of the key elements that I'd like you to think about in terms of the messengers themselves, the centrality of the message, and the importance of the media as to why the Reformation was as successful as it was. Here we are sitting, several hundred years after the Protestant Reformation, and these issues are still very much present with us. How long this division will take, I don't know, but it is something that has a very contemporary feeling to it, and that you still have people today who are committed either to their Catholic faith or to various traditions within the Protestant fold. And so I hope this survey's been useful, at least to give you some outlines as to what took place in the 16th centuries and how important this was from an ideological and religious standpoint. And I hope to hear some of your questions and comments that you have online. And for now, I hope you have a great day, and I'll talk to you soon.